Section 3 of Buff, a Collie and Other Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ellen Preckel. Buff, a Collie and Other Dog Stories by Albert Payson Terhune. Buff, a Collie. The Hunt is Up, Part 1. Michael Trent stood knee-deep in a gray-white drift that eddied and surged about him in tumultuous, soft waves, almost threatening to engulf him. The gray-white drift filled the tiny field in whose center Trent was standing. Its ragged edges were spilling in irregular driblets into the adjoining fields and the road, scattering thence athwart the near countryside. To descend to bare fact, Michael Trent was in the middle of a milling and unruly flock of merino sheep, and he was, incidentally, in more or less of a fix. Of these sheep, 70 had belonged to his farm for months, and he had just added to them 2 additional flocks, new bought, of 30 and of 25 each, making a grand total of 125. This morning he had undertaken to pasture the 3 groups together in a single paddock field, while he should assort from the full flock a detachment of 40, which he planned to drive to Boone Lake the following morning for the rural metropolis monthly market day. It had seemed a simple thing, this opening of the gates from 2 fields, and driving into a 3rd field the occupants of the other 2. So simple had it appeared that Trent had not even enlisted the services of his beautiful collie Buff in the petty task. Buff had been sent a half hour earlier to drive the farm's little bunch of cattle to the forest pasture a mile to the east, and he was not yet back. Trent had not bothered to wait for the collie's return before herding the 3 flocks of sheep into one. He had merely opened the gates leading into the central field where were pastured his original flock, and driven the newer occupants of those 2 fields into the middle one. The trouble had set in, as trouble is forever waiting to do, where sheep are concerned. One of the 2 new flocks had stampeded at sight and scent of the strange flocks and of the still more strange man. The stampeding flock had ploughed straight into and through the thick of the others, jostling and shoving them roughly, and communicating to them the stampede impulse. That had been quite enough, and all at once there were 125 crazy sheep surging around Trent and radiating away in every direction. Their fear-driven bodies had found a weak panel in the hurdle fence that bordered the road. Down flapped the hurdle, and through the gap the nearest sheep began to dribble. The remainder were in great and ever-increasing danger of injury from the mad plungings of their companions. Another accidental shove had loosed the half-fastened latch on the center field's gate, which Trent had neglected to clamp when he came into the paddock, and another leakage seeped out through that opening. Helpless, wrathful, Trent waded through the turmoil, trying in vain to restore quiet, and to make his way to one or both of the apertures, before a wholesale stampede should empty the field through gate or hurdle, bruising and perhaps killing some of the weaker sheep against the sides of the gap. In his extremity, the farmer put his fingers to his lips and sent forth a whistle, agonizingly piercing and shrill. Then he turned back to his futile labors of calming the stampede. Because he turned back thus, he missed a sight really worth seeing. Over the brow of a ridge, across the winding high road, flashed a tawny and white shape that was silhouetted for an instant in the pulsing skyline. The shape of a large collie, running as no dog but a collie or a greyhound can run. Close to earth in his sweeping stride, Buff was coming at full speed in response to the far-heard whistle. As he breasted the ridge crest, the dog took in the scene below him in a single glance. He saw the milling and straggling sheep, and his distracted master in the center of the panic throng. Thus he did not wait as usual for the signals Trent had taught him in working sheep. Instead, he went into action on his own account. Through the waves of grayish-white, a tawny and wedge-shaped head clove its way at express-train speed. With seeming aimlessness, Buff swirled through the mass, sheering now to the right, now to the left, now wheeling, now halting with a menace of thundering barks. Yet not one move was thrown away, not one step was without definite purpose. As by miracle, the charging sheep began to shape up in the field's center, and while they were still following this centrifugal impulse, Buff was gone from among them. Out into the high road he flew, not waiting to find either of the openings, but taking the tall hurdles in his stride. And in another second or so he had caught up with the rearmost of the stragglers, had passed it, and flashed on toward the more distant strays. Before the sheep in the paddock had shaken off their Buff-given impulse to crowd to the center of the enclosure, the collie had rounded up the scampering and bleating strays, and was driving them in a reluctant huddle through the gateway, and in among their fellows once more. Then, without resting, he swung shut the gate, an easy trick long since taught to him, as to many another working collie, and was guarding with his body the gap made by the overset hurdle. Trent ran up, fixed the hurdle in place, and then turned to pet and praise his exultant dog. "Buff," he declared, taking the collie's fluffy head between his two gnarled hands, "you're worth 10 times your weight in hired men, and you're the best side partner and chum a lonely chap ever had." Buff grinned, licked his master's hand in quick friendliness, then lay down at Trent's feet for an instant's rest. And for the 1000th time in the past 3 years, the man noted something in the collie's pose that baffled him. For though Buff was lying upright and not on his side, both hind legs were stretched straight out behind him. Normally no collie lies thus, nor does any other canine that is not the possessor of a strong strain of bulldog. It was Buff's favourite posture, and Buff had every point of a purebred collie, indeed of the highest type of show collie. The man's bewilderment was roused, thus, from time to time, by the dog's various bulldog traits, such as lying with hind legs out behind him, or of holding a grip with the grim stubbornness of a pit terrier rather than with the fiery dash of a true collie, or of diving for the heels of a driven cattle instead of for nose and ear. Waiting only for a moment while Buff was breathing himself after his hard run across the country, and his harder rounding up of the flock, Trent chirped to the collie and prepared to shut the 2 new consignments of merinos back in their respective pens. The mingling of the 3 flocks had been a mistake. Until their forthcoming drive to market, the 3 bunches would fare better among their own acquaintances than among strange sheep. But the task was no easy one. To a casual eye, all the milling sheep looked just alike. Trent could distinguish by his personal red mark his original flock, but the 2 sets of strangers were unmarked, wherefore his chirp to Buff. The moment the collie was made to see what was required of him, he was in the thick of the jostling turmoil again, flashing in and out like a streak of tawny fire, seeming to have no objective but to be scampering without any special purpose. Yet within 50 seconds he had headed a scared sheep through the gateway into the right paddock where stood his master, then another and yet another sheep. Then a huddled half-dozen of them cantered bleatingly into the paddock. While Trent looked on in wonder, Buff proceeded to segregate until the entire 25 that belonged in this particular field were back within its boundaries. Trent shifted to the opposite paddock, whence he had turned the second flock of 30 into the central enclosure, and here Buff repeated his unerring performance. Though Trent was filled with amazed admiration at his pet's discernment, yet he recognized there was nothing miraculous in it. Buff had herded both these new flocks into the pastures at least 3 times before. On their way from pasture, during the few days Trent had owned them, he had become familiar with their scents and their separate identities, after the uncanny fashion of the best sort of working collie. As the job ended and Trent started homeward, with Buff trotting chummily beside him, a slender black saddle horse came single-footing around the bend of the road between the paddocks and the farmhouse. Astride the black sat a figure as slender and high-bred as the mount's own. The rider was a girl of perhaps 20, clad in crash and booted. At sight of the man and the collie, she waved her crop gaily at them and put her horse to a lope by a shift of the snaffle rein. Trent's bronzed face went red with surprised pleasure at the equestrian vision bearing down on him. Buff, after a single doubtful glance, recognized horse and rider, and set off at a run to welcome them. "Why, I didn't know you were at home yet, Ruth!" exclaimed Trent, reaching up to take the gauntleted little hand extended to greet him. "Your father said you'd be in the city another month. I saw him at the store last evening, and he said—" "Yes," she interrupted, "I know. He hadn't got my telegram then. Aunt Hester had to go out west to take care of her son, my cousin Dick Clinton, you remember. He has a ranch in Idaho. She had a letter from him yesterday morning saying he'd broken his leg. So she packed up right away and took the night train west. And I came home." "Oh," said Trent, in an effort at sympathy. "And you had to cut your visit in half. What a shame!" "No," she denied guiltily. "It wasn't a shame. It was a blessing. I oughtn't to say so, but it was. She did everything to give me a good time, and I enjoyed it, too, ever so much. But all the while I was homesick for these dear hills, and I'm so glad to get back to them. It's queer," she added, "how I've grown to love the Boone Lake region, when Dad and I have lived here barely 18 months. 18 months and 9 days, gravely corrected Trent. "I remember. I had gone to town that evening to get the mail, and when I passed by the old Brander house I saw lights in it. At the post office they told me a New York man and his daughter, some people named Hemmerton, had moved in that day, and that they had come here for Mr. Hammerton's health. It wasn't more than a week, just 6 days to be exact, after that, when your father stopped here to ask me about the commission people I was dealing with in the city. He spent the morning, and he asked me to come and see him. It was the next evening I called. That was when I met you. So—" "Do you keep a diary?" she asked, in an amusement that seemed tinged with embarrassment. "Or have you a genius for remembering dates?" "And," pursued Trent, "it was just 16 days after that when we went horseback riding the first time. It may be a bit of silly superstition," he went on reluctantly, "but I've always dated the start of this farm toward real success from the time you people moved to Boone Lake. Ever since then I've prospered. Another 6 months will find me in shape to install the last lot of up-to-date machinery, and to take over that 80-acre tract of Holden's that I've got the option on. Then I can begin to call my soul my own, and live like real people. And the first day I can do that, I'm going to put my whole fortune, and my life too, to the biggest test in the world. A test I hadn't any right to put it to while I was staggering along on the edge of bankruptcy, and with the future all so hazy. In 6 months I'll be able to ask a question that will show me whether all my luck is dead sea fruit, or the greatest thing that ever happened." He talked on, ramblingly, with an effort at unconcern, avoiding her eyes. But his gaze was on her little gloved hand as it lay athwart the horse's mane, and he saw it tremble and clench. Trent was half glad, half frightened, that she had caught the drift of his blundering words. Before he could continue, Buff created a diversion by routing a large and terrified rabbit out of a fence corner and charging down the road toward them in noisy pursuit of his prey. Bunny fled in blind panic straight between the nervous horse's forefeet. The mount snorted and reared. As Ruth skillfully mastered the plunging steed, Trent caught the bridle close to the bit, and at the same time whistled Buff to heel. Unwillingly, but instantly, the collie abandoned his delightful chase and trotted obediently back to his master. "Don't scold him," begged Ruth. "It wasn't his fault." "I'm not going to scold him," laughed Trent, ruffling the dog's ears. "It's many a long month since Buff needed a scolding. He didn't drive the rabbit this way. The rabbit drove itself before Buff could choose the direction. Buff is splendid protection for you, isn't he?" she broke in, a tinge of nervousness in her soft voice. "Why, personally, I don't stand in great need of protection," he smiled. "I'm not exactly a timid little flower, but he protects the farm and the house and the livestock as efficiently as a machine-gun company could. He's a born watchdog." Buff, realizing he was under discussion, sat down in the road between the man and the girl. He was wriggling with self-consciousness and fanning the dust into a little whirlwind with the lightning sweeps of his plumy tail, as he grinned expectantly from one to the other of the speakers. But the collie's grin found no answer on Ruth Hammerton's flower-tinted face. The girl's eyes had grown grave, and there was a tinge of uneasiness in them. "I hope you're right," she began, hesitantly, "in saying you don't need any protection. And probably I'm foolish. But that's why I rode out here this morning." "To protect me?" he asked quizzically, yet perplexed at her new bearing. "To risk your thinking me impertinent," she evaded, "by mixing into something that doesn't concern me." "Anything that concerns me," he said as she hesitated again, "concerns you too, so far as you'll let it. What's the matter?" She drew a long breath, knit her dark brows, and plunged into the distasteful mission that had brought her to the Trent farm. "In the first place," she began, "do you know 2 men named Con Hegan and Billy Gates?" In stark surprise, Trent stared up at her. "Why, yes," he made answer. "Of course I do. I have good reason to know them. I've told you the story. I told it to your father, too, before I accepted his invitation to come and see him. They were the 2 men I found in my kitchen when I—" "Yes, yes," she interposed hastily, as though trying to shield him from memories that must be painful. "I know. Of course, I remember. But you never told me their names. I'm certain you didn't, or they'd have been familiar to me when I heard them this morning." "This morning?" echoed Trent, puzzled. "I was at the store doing the marketing," she explained. "Some men were loafing on the steps just outside the window, and one of them said, 'A fellow from down Logan way told me just now that Con Hegan and Billy Gates are due to be turned loose to morrow.' And one of the other men said, 'Then Trent had better hire a special cop and take out another life insurance policy.' Both of 'em swore they'd get him, if they was to go to the chair for it. And that's one kind of an oath neither of 'em's liable to break. I wouldn't like to be in his shoes just now." That was all I could hear, but it worried me. I didn't associate the names with those men you had told me about, perhaps because the phrase 'turned loose' didn't mean anything to me. But I came out here to tell you just the same. It wasn't so much what the fellow on the store steps said, as the scared way he said it that frightened me. Oh, is there any real danger of—" "Nonsense!" laughed Trent. "There's no danger at all, and you're not to give the matter another minute of your precious thought. But it was bully of you to come out here and warn me, to care enough to—" "You're making light of it, just to make me stop worrying," she accused. "I know you are. Won't you please notify the police about their threat? Won't you go armed? Won't you lock your house ever so carefully, and keep indoors after dark, and—" "And wear warm flannels next to my skin all summer?" supplemented Trent with vast solemnity. "And carry an umbrella, and wear rubbers if the day is at all stormy, and—" "Stop!" she commanded, a hint of tears in her troubled young voice. "You're making fun of me." "Heaven forbid!" he disclaimed piously. "You are," she accused. "And you're doing it to lead me to think you aren't in any danger, so that I won't worry. But there is danger, and I know it. I'm positive of it, now that you've told me who those men really are. Oh, can't you—" "Listen!" he begged. "You're getting all wrought up over nothing, Ruth. It's wonderful to have you bother your head over my safety, but I am not going to let you do it. Here's the idea. Hegan and Gates belonged to the Riverside gang over in South Boone. The gang was cleared out some years ago. Some of its members went to jail. The police had nothing definite on those two, so they let them alone. They picked up a living by their wits as semi-stationary tramps, and they kept their petty thefts from being found out. Then, when they'd sent me to prison, they'd had it in for me ever since the time I caught them near my hen roost and ordered them off my land, to the accomplishment of a stray kick or so. They went into the business on a larger scale, using my house as a place to store their plunder and to hide out in, when the neighbours might be suspecting them of a share in the robberies. When Buff and I collared them, they went all to pieces and confessed everything, just as I told you before. Now I leave it to you if two such pitifully cowardly sneak thieves are likely to risk another jail sentence by trying to harm me. It's ridiculous. Just the same, I'm as much your debtor for warning me as if the danger were real." Ruth had dismounted during the talk. Now, turning to the horse, she prepared to get into the saddle once more. But first she bent down and laid her soft cheek against the delighted Buff's head. Under cover of the collie's glad whimper of friendliness, she whispered very low, "Take care of him, Buff. Oh, take care of him for me." Then, with assumed lightness, she said, as Trent lifted her to the saddle, "Probably you're right, but it didn't do any harm to warn you. I'm sorry if I've seemed foolish. Good bye." The little black horse cantered away. Michael, Trent and Buff stood in the middle of the road, watching the girl out of sight. Then Trent turned slowly to his chum. "Buff, old man," said he, "we made a good bluff of it just now, you and I. All the same, it's up to us both to keep our eyes open for a while. Hegan and Gates were soaked with cheap whiskey and sodden and jumpy after a week's carouse when the chief of police sweated them. And he sure did sweat them good and hard. It smashed their nerve, because they were in prime shape to have it smashed. And that's how he got them to go all to pieces and confess. That and the goods he found on them. And besides, he told each of them separately that the other one had squealed, and made them sore at each other that way. But it wasn't like either Gates or Hegan to give in. When they were normal, they were as tough a pair of birds as I care to see. They've had nearly 3 years to sober up in and get back their nerve by hard work and plain food and no drink, Buff. And unless I've got them both sized up all wrong, they've been spending most of that 3 years in planning how to get back at the man who spoiled their game and thrashed them hard and got them put away. They've had plenty of time to store up venom, Buff, and plenty of venom to store up. Yes, and a good alibi, too, to clear them if anything happens to me. Buff, we aren't going to be fools enough to worry, but we'll keep awake just the same. And, Lord, but wasn't it glorious of her to care enough about me to come way out here and warn me. Buff, she knew what I meant, too, when I told her about having the right pretty soon to ask a question. I wonder if I'm pig-headed not to have asked it long ago, instead of waiting till I had something beside my measly self to offer." During his mumbled address to the wistfully listening dog, he had been moving homeward. Now, standing on his neat porch, the man looked about him, over his well-kept farm and its trim buildings, with a little throb of pride, as he contrasted it with the way the home had looked on his return from prison 3 years earlier. The world, all at once, seemed to him a wonderful place to live in, and life seemed unbelievably sweet. His glance strayed down the long yellow road toward the old Brander place, and his lean face softened with a glow that transfigured it. End of Section 3